He was a fisherman. Of this there was no doubt. Living by the side of the sea where the waves would roll and rock, the boats were all ready to go out and catch fish. And that is just what he did. He was tall, he was strong, he was handsome. And every day when he threw out his net, he would always catch fish. No matter where he went, his net was always full. He was strong in his arm, he was handsome in his face, his back was straight. And it wasn't just those women who walk upon two legs who found him attractive. Oh no, underneath the water there would be mermaids, half a woman and half a fish, who would look up through the water and see just how handsome this fisherman was. Now, he did have a wife and a horse and a dog, but these mermaids would make sure that they would always fill his nets just so that they could see him standing there, tall and strong, casting out his net and catching his fish. Now, he had a house, a wife, a dog and a horse. But as we all do, one day he spoke out loud as the sunset was crowding around him. He spoke out loud and said, "I wonder what it would be like to have a son or a daughter by my side." The chiefest of all of the mermaids heard him, and she went and she swam further and further and deeper down to the ocean floor and found a fish. A fish that was as wide as a man's hand, as long as a man's arm, round golden eyes and beautiful blood-red fins at its neck. And she placed that inside of the fisherman's net. Now, he'd been used to catching long, thin silver fish, and when he pulled in his net and saw this beautiful golden fish, he was surprised. And he spoke out loud, "I've never seen a fish like that before." And now the chiefest of all of the mermaids came to the top of the water and whispered above the waves, "Take that fish, take the fish and wash it. Cut off its fins, and the water that you use, give that to your dog. Then scrape the fish and all of the scaly water, wash it off and give that to your horse. Finally, you must gut the fish and wash the fish and give the blooded water to your wife. And then you and you alone must eat the fish." The fisherman was surprised. He didn't know where this voice was coming from, but still he did as he was asked. After he'd sold all of the silver fish to the king, he came back and he washed the fish and cut off its fins and gave that water to his dog. Then he scaled the fish and washed the fish and gave that to his horse. And when he had gutted the fish and washed the fish, he gave that to his wife. And in what seemed no more than a passing sigh across the moon, he found that his dog was with puppies. He found that his horse was with foals. He found that his wife was with child. And sure enough, the dog gave birth to two beautiful chestnut brown dogs that were the spit of one another. No one could tell them apart. And the horse gave birth to two beautiful foals. And again, no one could tell them apart. And his wife gave birth to twins, two boys, and no one could tell them apart. He was so overjoyed at having children like this that he took two olive branches and placed them in the ground, just to remember the day that he was a father to two sons. He took the fish. He cooked it only for himself. But when he cut into one side of the fish, he found inside of the fish that there was a sword, a golden sword, no longer than your little finger. And on the other side of the fish there was another golden sword, no longer than your finger. And he did not know what to do with them at first, but since he had planted the olive branches, he decided to place them in the ground. And here is a strange thing, because those swords grew taller, longer and sharper. But so did his sons. It was almost as if they were growing faster than any child in all of this world. And when they were 5 years old, they were given the dogs to look after. And one boy called his dog Chain Maker. And the second dog with the second child was called Chain Breaker. And they rode upon their 2 horses, and to be perfectly honest, it was probably only their parents who could tell the 2 apart. The olive branches grew taller and stronger, and if one of the children were ill, then the leaves on that olive branch would wither until they had become well again. So here is the thing. They grew bigger and obeyed their father and mother and learned to fish as their father had fished. But one day, when the oldest one, and yes, I know that they are twins, but there is always one child that is born slightly earlier than the other, the oldest one decided that he wished to go out and see what he could see in all of the world. And so he went to his father. "Father, I would wish to go out on a journey upon my horse with Chain Maker by my side and see the world. Please give me your blessing." The father smiled. "I shall give you more than just my blessing. I shall give you the golden sword." For now the sword was fully formed, sharp, bright and brilliant. And this boy set off on his way. He waved goodbye to his younger brother, and he went away from the side of the sea and went along a road. Now, as he was riding with Chain Maker by his side upon his horse and riding, he rode through lush green meadows by the sides of great forests. And then in a clearing he saw that there was a beautiful castle, white and wide with golden gates at its front. And as he got closer to it, from out of the castle there came a king with a crown upon his head and beautiful robes upon his back. And he looked and he said, "Welcome, kind stranger. You are welcome to my land and to my castle. What is it that you do?" The oldest of the twins looked and said, "Your Majesty, I am travelling far around to see what I can see of all of this world." But the king did not live inside of the castle alone. He had not one but 2 daughters. They were not twins, but he had 2 daughters. And he looked and he said to this fisherman's son, "Which of my 2 daughters pleases you the most? For you can marry her." Well, it so happened that he, being the oldest son, looked towards the 2 sisters, and it was the oldest that he liked. And the 2 of them were married. A cardinal was there. A mayor came to the wedding. But on the wedding day, his new wife said to him, "You are welcome to travel inside of all of this great castle, but please promise me that you will not go down to the bottommost part of the castle and look out of the window that is there." He thought it was a strange request, but he agreed to it. And he wandered about the castle with its great and beautiful staircases, its fountains, all of the beautiful stonework. And he loved that place. He loved to be inside of the great castle. He would wander along the corridors. He would marvel at the way that the castle itself had been made. But curiosity is a terrible thing. He had been told not to go to the window at the bottommost part of the castle. He'd been told not to look outside, and inside of his heart he'd placed such a great dread that he thought it must be a terrible thing. But curiosity is a terrible thing, and one day he could not stop himself. He went to the window and he looked out, and he saw that there was a land that was filled with tall, lush, sweet green grass. And when he spoke to his wife, he looked at her and said, "Why did you tell me not to look out of the window? There is nothing but a fine meadow outside of the window." And here his wife wept and wailed, screamed and cried, "You have looked out towards the land where many will go but none return, and now you will have a curiosity inside of you that you will not be satisfied until you go." It was true. He couldn't stop himself. All he wanted to do was ride upon his horse and have Chainmaker by his side. And one day his wife knew there was no chance that she could keep him trapped inside of the castle, and she got some servants to make sure that his horse was ready, to make sure that Chainmaker was ready. And off he rode. And as he rode along the way, he saw that the tall, sweet green grass was fine for the horse to eat. It was good and it was plentiful, but then it was as if the grass was being covered with dust, and the grass was no longer as green. And then his nose, he could smell sausages, fat, meaty pork sausages being cooked. And in the distance, when he looked, he could see that there was a small house, and all around the house there were stones about the size of men and women, dogs and horses. But he paid no heed to that, for the smell of the sausages was just so much that he could not stop himself, and he rode a little faster, never looking to see that the grass was shorter and more covered in dust. And in time, when he got to the house, he saw that there was a woman, an old woman, who had teeth that hung down and curved around her jaw, and on the top of her head all she had were 12 strands of hair. She looked at him and said, "Oh, sir, you are welcome inside of my house, but please," and here she pulled the hairs from the top of her head and gave 6 in one hand and 6 in the other, and said, "Oh, please, I do not wish to be bitten by your dog. I do not wish to be trampled by your horse. Please tie them up and use my hair to attach them to the side of the house, so that I will be safe, and then I shall give to you food, pork sausages, fat, round and meaty." He had travelled for some time, and he was hungry, and so he took these strands of the old woman's hair and tied them firmly around Chainmaker's neck, and tied it around his horse's neck, and tied it, and went inside and sat himself down at the table. The old woman, with her terrible teeth and a bald head, started to bustle all around him. "Oh, such a fine young man, a beautiful young man. You are welcome inside of my house." And she went outside, and by her side and from a belt she had a bag, and in the bag there was dust, and she pulled out some of the dust and she blew it into the face of Chainmaker, and the dog turned to stone, and the hairs upon her head that had been used to tie it turned into iron. She went to his horse and took another handful of dust and blew it into the eyes and nose of his horse, and his horse too became like stone, with an iron chain about its neck. as she bustled and fussed by him, "Such a fine young man, such a beautiful young man, come here and eat." And with the sausages upon the plate, all he could look at was the food. And as he was just about to eat, she took some of the dust and into his eyes, and he too was turned to stone. His lifeless body was dragged outside and placed in all of the serried ranks of all of the other people who had come to this land where no one returns. And the old woman had sat and ate the sausages herself. Now, down by the side of the sea, his younger brother looked towards the olive branch that had been planted upon the day that he had been born, and he could see that his brother's branch was starting to wither, and he knew that his brother was in trouble. He went to his father. "My father, I would wish to go and find what it is that has happened to my brother." The father was frantic, for he too knew that there must be some danger involved in this place. And so, the youngest one got himself ready, placed a scarf about his neck, and went on his way. He had his horse, he had Chain Breaker by his side, and sure enough, as he rode along, he went till he came to where there was the castle, and the king came out. He did not know that this boy who had arrived there was a twin to the first one that he'd seen. my son, you are welcome here. Come and sit with us." And the wife, the oldest of the king's daughters, thought that her husband had returned. She fussed about him, she pulled at him, she said, "Oh, I am so pleased that you have returned and now you are here. It is good to see you back, for many have gone but none have returned, and you have come back." And the youngest brother looked and thought, "This woman thinks that I am my brother. She thinks that I am her husband." And all throughout the meal she fed him, she fussed about him, she moved around him, she looked at him, she said, "Oh, it is good to have you back. You are welcome back. It's good that you have gone like no one else has gone, and you have returned." And the younger one was starting to get very worried, because now the night was drawing in, and his brother's wife would wish for him to lie down in a bed with her. What could he do? And now, as the youngest brother lay down in that place, which was not his place, lay down upon the bed that was his brother's bed, with his brother's wife, he did not know what to do. But then it occurred to him. He took his great golden sword and placed it in the middle of the bed, with the point towards him and the hilt towards his brother's wife. And she spoke and she looked at him and said, "Why do you place this great golden sword down the middle of the bed?" The youngest brother spoke. "It is because I have been given a vow. I have been given a task, and I must leave this sword in the middle of the bed." His brother's wife fell asleep. But all through that night, he fretted and worried and wondered what could possibly have happened to his older brother. The next morning, when he arose, he tried to work out what had happened to his brother, to his oldest brother. He didn't know where he could possibly be, and he looked all around the castle. And he went down to the bottommost part of the castle and found the window and looked out. And he called to his brother's wife. He said, What is this window and where is this land? His brother's wife looked at him and said, but surely, my dear, that is the land that you went to and you returned from, where no one else has ever returned. And so he knew that that was where his brother must be. He called for his horse and he called for Chain Breaker to be made ready so that he could go and travel and find his brother. And as before, he rode along that way. He rode through all of the sweet green grass until it became dusted, and then he could smell the pork sausages in the air and see the house. As he was getting closer, you could see all of these statues lying up in long straight rows, and some of them he could recognise as men and women, dogs and horses. But it was when he got to the cottage, and there was the woman with her terrible teeth that hung down by her jaw, and now she only had 2 hairs on the top of her head. She looked and said, "Oh, good sir, you're welcome in this place. Please take these hairs, and 1 and 2, and tie up your horse and your dog." Now, the youngest brother was no fool. He did not tie his horse up. He merely laid the hair over the top of its neck. He merely put one of the hairs over Chain Breaker's neck and did not tie them. When she sat him down, she was there. She fussed. She said, "Oh, such a fine young man to have inside of my house." And here, as he looked, he saw her reaching towards this bag, and he knew that there would be no good in this. And so he called out, "Chain Breaker!" And the dog rushed in and pinned the old woman down upon the ground and started to scratch at her. She yelled, "Stop, stop, please stop." "I will tell my dog to stop when you have released my brother." She took some of the dust and blew it into the lifeless stone form of his brother. And the brother stood up. "My brother, what a long and deep sleep I have had. I am pleased to see you." The woman, the youngest, said to her, "You must go and release my horse and my dog." And so she went into Chain Maker, to his horse. And now the youngest brother called for both dogs. "Chain Maker, Chain Breaker, kill this woman!" And sure enough, the 2 dogs ripped the old woman until she was nothing more than a stain of blood upon the ground. The 2 brothers went out and blew dust into all of the stones that surrounded the house, and the 2 of them watched as all of the people were brought back to life and travelled this way and that and forwards and backwards, rejoicing to be released from the stone. And now the 2 of them started to ride with their 2 horses, their 2 dogs, as 2 brothers. And as they were riding along, the youngest looked and said, "My brother, there is something that I feel that I need to tell you. There is something that I do not want to tell you." The oldest brother looked puzzled. "What is it?" The youngest brother spoke. "When I travelled from our home by the side of the sea, I went along the road and came to the great castle, and when I was there, the king thought that I was you." The oldest brother smiled. "Well, we are but twins. But it's not just that, my brother. Your wife thought that I was you." And here the oldest brother did not look pleased. I did everything that I could, but I slept in the bed with your wife. And here the oldest brother took his sword and he struck his brother, struck him down with the golden sword, and left him there, dead. Now the oldest brother started to ride back towards the castle. And when he got there, the king hobbled and jumped with joy to see that he had returned yet again, not knowing that he had met the youngest brother. And his wife came down, the oldest sister, came down and hugged him and squeezed him and fed him. And that night, as they lay down in the bed, he laid himself down upon the bed and did not place the sword in between the two of them. His wife sat up. "My sweet husband, why do you not place a golden sword down the middle of the bed as you did the other night? Has your vow, has your task been fulfilled?" And the oldest brother realized that the younger had been so honourable that he had placed the sword down the middle of the bed, and now all he worried and wondered about was how he could try and make amends for unjustly killing his own brother. He could not sleep that night. He went out and he tried to find a way that he could bring his brother back to life, and he found that there was an old woman by the side of the road. She looked and said, "Kind sir, why are you so sad and troubled? What is it in this world?" And he spoke about how he had unjustly struck his brother down with his great sharp golden sword. The old woman smiled. "Up there at midday there will be a thin, scaly green lizard. It will be panting in the heat of the sun. And what you must do is this. You must take your golden sword and smite it and cut it into 2 parts, with one side at either side of your golden sword. Place them at the neck of your brother, and he will arise." The oldest brother went, and sure, by the stroke of midday, he went and found the long, thin, green, scaled lizard, panting in the shadow of a boulder, and he struck it with one half upon one side of the sword and the other half upon the other, and he raced until he came to where his brother lay. And he took the 2 halves of the lizard and placed them on either side of his brother's neck. And no sooner had he rubbed the blood of the lizard upon the cut at his brother's throat than the brother leapt up. "My brother, what a strange sleep I have had." And he did not tell him of what he had done, but he knew just how honourable his younger brother had been, and the two of them rode all of the way back to the great castle. And it was there that the king was quite surprised, for when he looked, he could see 2 where once there had only been 1. And the oldest daughter looked, for she could not tell one from the other. It was only the oldest brother who spoke and said, "It is me. I am your husband." And the youngest, he got married to the youngest sister. And when the king died, for he only had 2 daughters, all of that kingdom was divided between the 2 daughters. And those 2 fishermen's sons lived inside of the castle with the horses, their dogs, and their wives, and lived and ruled so well.